Iran has been a key player in the history of the world, and it's a key player in the Middle East today, yet we seem to know very little about it. We'll learn more next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. Iran may not have played a prominent role thus far in the historic changes sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa, but it is no stranger to political upheaval. The current Iranian regime, born out of revolution more than 3 decades ago, often has drawn the ire of citizens who seek their own destiny. 2 years ago, in the face of major demonstrations, the government violently cracked down, echoing the events in the region today. Posted videos on the internet were a main way of finding out what was happening. Is this repression an indication of strength or weakness? What's really going on inside Iran? Is a Persian Spring in the making? What does all of this mean for the United States? Our guest today will help answer these questions. Roya Hakakian is an Iranian-American author, journalist, and television and film producer. She is also the author of a new book, Assassins of the Turquoise Palace, which tells the story of the Iranian government's murderous campaign to silence the opposition at home and abroad. Welcome to the show, Ms. Hakakian.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your work in terms of Iran. I know it's part of your heritage, but how did you decide to go in this direction? And we'll talk about the book as well.
It doesn't feel like work to me. I feel like I am merely doing what, I'm merely involved with the ideas and thoughts that inhabit my head for most of the time. And on a day-to-day basis, it takes a different direction as to whether I'm going to execute one idea versus another. I do several different things when it comes to Iran. Over the years, it's taken on sort of its own form with the help of a couple of other Iranians. I established an organization called Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, and our purpose was to try to kind of create a reservoir of information about violations of human rights in Iran since the rise of this new regime, which is not so new anymore after 32 years. But we all felt very strongly that a lot of the evidence, a lot of issues, violations, crimes that had occurred under the hands of the new regime were falling by the wayside or being shoved under the rug, so to speak. And we really just wanted to create some kind of an archive where these things would be committed to memory and history wouldn't be rewritten over and over again. But, you know, I also write. I started out as a poet in Persian. I write books, as you mentioned earlier. So depending on what day of the week it is and how much coffee I've had, I can go and do one of the very many things that I do.
I think most people probably are aware that there are human rights issues in Iran, but what would be some of the worst abuses that you can point to that might be surprising to some of our folks today?
I think of Iran as the greatest apartheid state in the world today. Yes, you know, we have Saudi Arabia where women don't have equal rights to men, but the government of Iran insists and boasts of being a very egalitarian, Islamic egalitarian, but egalitarian nonetheless. And it boasts of being very good to women, being, in fact, creating lots of opportunities for women. And yet it's an apartheid state. You have gender discrimination in full swing throughout the country, and the rights of women were rolled back in major, major ways since the 1960s and 1970s. Women lost the right to divorce, the right to travel. And you know, for a country, for a group of people who have had those rights to then take them back, it's been a devastating blow to the women of Iran. So I think oftentimes, because we associate Iran in, you know, since 1979, since the reconfiguration of the Middle East, since the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini to power, people think of Iran in the same way that they oftentimes think of Afghanistan and assume that women have always been an underclass in Iran. Well, that's not true. Women used to have a very prominent role within the society, and they were used to being ministers and university professors and lots of these things. I suppose the main ones were the domestic rights they had in at home with regards to having the rights to retain their children in light of divorce and all sorts of things. When those rights were rolled back as a result of the regime change and the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, I think that put Iran on the map as a gender apartheid in a way that South Africa was on the map as a racial apartheid.
But in addition to that, what about all the minorities who live in Iran? So many people think this is a Persian-dominant country, and yet the Persian population is only about half. So you've got a huge number of different ethnic minority groups, and are they treated that much worse? You talk about the effect on Persian women, but what about the ethnic minorities?
Absolutely. I suppose among the minority issues, the one that's most devastating and also pressing is the issue of the religious minorities, namely the Baha'i in Iran. The Baha'is are a group that really is a faction that separated from Islam over 100 years ago. And in a way, they are the most, not in a way, I should say that positively, they're the most seriously persecuted minority, religious minority in Iran today. Once a member of the Baha'i community admits to being a Baha'i, that person, he or she, instantly loses the right to educate himself or herself, the right to attend university, and pretty much everything else goes with that. And I think many of them have been arrested. 13 of their leaders have been languishing in prison over the past couple of years. And overall, when you look at the state of religious minorities in Iran, and that includes the Baha'i, the Jews of Iran, and the Jewish community in Iran remains a relatively robust community of nearly 20,000. Zoroastrians, who were originally the original inhabitants of Iran before Islam came to Iran, and Armenian Christians who, surprisingly, their numbers are growing because there is suddenly a surge in the number of conversions in Iran to Christianity, and they are also being heavily persecuted. So I would say that the state of religious minorities in Iran is particularly alarming, and more so given, for instance, the new changes and developments in with respect to conversions to Christianity, which have somehow become very popular.
In light of that problem, in light of the fact that so many people in Iran seem displeased with the government, and with all the examples of uprisings happening elsewhere in the region, we had, of course, uprisings in Iran many times in the past, including a few years ago, which were suppressed. Is it reasonable to talk about a Persian Spring?
I think we saw the first blossoms of the Persian Spring in June of 2009 after the uprisings due to the fraudulent elections of President Ahmadinejad. However, I think the issue that remains sort of the fundamental question within the Iranian movement is not so much a political one. Of course, there is a pragmatic problem at the heart of all this, which is, you know, who will be the leader and who will really stand against this regime in delivering the public to victory. Setting that aside, I think the Iranian populace has a philosophical problem, which is how do you overthrow a theocracy without overthrowing God? That's really the problem that, although we've had other Arab Springs, other springs throughout the Middle East, none of those nations have yet reconciled with or solved the question of what do we do with the role of religion within the government. The Iraqis haven't quite figured it out. The Egyptians are struggling with it. The Pakistanis are in the throes of it and are losing that war. And I think it's an ongoing issue that, if anything, Iran is ahead of the curve in trying to address it. I think part of the difficulty is for them to try to, for the population of Iran, to try to say it's okay to overthrow a supreme leader or to overthrow a government that claims to be a representative of God without undermining God, without undermining Islam, and the separation of the two is possible without all the rest of us becoming sinners for all of eternity. I think if we sort that problem out, if the nation kind of reconciles with that, then the rest will be very easy, because the disenchantment is widespread. And unlike China, for instance, after Tiananmen, Iran has done nothing to address the economic problems of a very demanding, and rightly so, youthful population throughout.
So this is a regime that seems to be losing legitimacy with each passing week, and I'm wondering at what point will the frustration build up so that it can no longer be contained. I mean, the Iranian people stood up in the late 1970s against a seemingly immovable force, and that force was swept aside, and now, like you said, if the religious issue can be sorted out, it could happen again.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, it would be very interesting to watch two upcoming elections. The first one are coming up in March of this year, and they are I should say, in March of 2012, and they're the parliamentary elections, and following that, there will be another presidential elections. And I think those will probably be very tumultuous moments that are forthcoming. I think one of the issues to sort out is, in fact, a pragmatic one. The two contenders for the presidential elections in Iran this last time around have been somewhat under house arrest, and the public have had actually no access to those leaders. And I'm not sure how long the government can keep this up, especially in an election year. And even without those two figures, there will be others who will probably nominate themselves, and then the process will repeat itself, except that the last time around people weren't ready with a so-called plan B as to what to do if the results of those elections are not honored. How do we go forward? And I think this time around they will probably be ready for a plan B to come around and probably implement something else to show their protest.
Let's transition to your book. I think it's a very interesting examination of excesses on the part of the government, and we can say, okay, well, the opposition is persecuted at home. That's within the geographic boundaries of Iran. We understand that. But when you talk about moving into other countries and engaging in extrajudicial activities against opposition members in other places, in this case Germany, that's a completely different question. I think that's probably one of the most outrageous aspects of this. Tell us just briefly about the story, because you're the one who pieced this together, and it's a remarkable tale.
Well, this is the story of how the word fatwa really entered the Western lexicon. We come to think of the word fatwa as one that was for the first time introduced to Western audiences with the case of Salman Rushdie in 1988. However, Ayatollah Khomeini, who issued that fatwa against Salman Rushdie in 1988, had 10 years prior to that issued a fatwa against 500 Iranians, opposition leaders, artists, satirists, writers, intellectuals, Kurds, prominent Kurds, leading members of other prominent religious and ethnic communities. And he, through his henchmen around the globe, was going systematically through this list of 500 individuals. And among the places where these crimes occurred, where these assassinations occurred, is Washington, D.C., Geneva, Switzerland, Vienna in Austria, Paris, London, you name it. And what's extremely ironic is that about a third of the whole list had been gone through by the time the assassins get to the particular case that I write about. That case occurred in September of 1992. 8 leading Iranian exiles were having dinner at a restaurant in Berlin, Germany, and 2 men, one with a machine gun and the other with a handgun, walk in and shoot everyone sitting at a table, and 4 die instantly and 4 survive. Now you would say, how is it possible that on the streets of Berlin, Germany, somebody walks in with a machine gun? Well, because they had done it several dozen times before in all the places that I named, and the European community in general thought of these murders, thought of these assassinations as ones that they didn't enjoy having occur on their soil, but were not at the same time all that worth compromising trade relations with Iran over. And so not only they went on, but also they became bigger and bigger as years went by. So whereas initially an assassin would go and clandestinely try to behead someone or stab someone to death, 10 years later, by the time they get to 1992, they're walking into places with machine guns and openly opening fire at a group of 8 and killing 4. And I have a sense, I have this, based on all the research that I've done over the years, I have a sense that had Europe really taken a much stronger stance against these seemingly small and negligible assassinations to begin with, that probably the blueprint for much larger, bigger, and more dangerous terror operations would not have come into being. That it was because they were so readily open, or at least readily dismissive of these operations, that the Islamic terror networks in Europe grew and allowed the blueprint to exist, to be later used by bigger and much more evil networks to pick them up and make them operational then later on against us here in the West.
But today, is there greater understanding of this problem? Has your investigation into this issue made it possible for governments to say, we made a mistake and this is something we have to watch very closely, and is it still likely that these kinds of assassinations could be carried out in the future?
I think, well, perhaps one of the most effective things that Europe ever did against these sorts of operations was the story of the trial that I detail in the book itself. So the book begins as a crime whodunit, sort of a thriller, but then becomes soon thereafter a courtroom drama about whether the little guy, the victims, get their day in court and receive justice. And I think it's safe to say that the judgment from this court had a major effect on putting Iran on notice and really delivering a message very clearly to Iran that if you want to be part of the international community, if you want to have trade relations with us, you need to play by our rules. And our rules mandate that you don't execute even your own citizens on our soil. And that's that. And, you know, surprisingly, it cost us a lot less than waging wars, you know, on Iran or dropping bombs on them. And it was just as effective as if we had done any costlier effort to bring those terror operations to stop. Iran has not conducted another assassination in Europe, but it has in other places, in Europe against Iranian citizens. And the list of 500 was never completed. So it was effective. And I think looking at that case now is not only not only it's a fabulous story to re-examine and read, but it also very illuminating in terms of the possibilities that we should be looking at in this war against terror.
Has the Iranian government responded specifically to the book?
Not yet. It's brand new. But I think hopefully it will gather a lot more momentum. And I'm going to Washington very shortly to address the Democratic caucus, and I'm hoping that this will become part of the debate about the array of strategies that we have at our disposal in addressing terror operations. And one of them should be, and is, I hope, just the simple execution of the laws and bringing to trial certain perpetrators who have gone without really being tried or being prosecuted properly.
Are you optimistic about the short-term, intermediate-term future of Iran? Do you think change will come faster than some anticipate?
I think change is happening in Iran even as you and I speak here. I think it's inevitable. And I think if change comes to Iran, then one can be very hopeful that the entire region will change in a very meaningful way. Because I think it was from Iran in 1979 that the tone for what came in the next 30 years was set. And I think if a democracy takes hold in Iran in this authentic way through a homegrown democratic movement by the youth, then it would be very hard to prevent it from spreading throughout the region and really putting out, most importantly, I think, this dream of theocratic possibilities that other movements are entertaining. I think Egyptians aren't yet done. They're toying with the notion of what do we do with our, Islamic Brotherhood? How much power do we give them? How many seats in the parliament? And I think once Iran creates a democracy, creates a sort of republic that really separates the two without compromising the Islamic identity of its nation, then I think the whole region can expect to see a much brighter future ahead.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Ms. Akakian.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.